we are going to be welcoming our next speaker onto the stage. This is a young lady from Russellville High School, Miss Lilliana McGraw.
Within the past 300 years, we as humans have experienced more technological advancements than we have throughout the rest of history. The American Industrial Revolution, often referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution, began in the 1870s and continued through World War II. But what does this have to do with trees? According to an article done by Science Direct, quote, urban planning encompasses the preparation of plans for and the regulation and management of towns, cities, and metropolitan regions, end quote. Urban planning started in the United States in the late 19th century, right at the same time that the Second Industrial Revolution got its start. It was continued in use as new cities were being built up until the 1970s and was used to organize America's infrastructure in its time of incredible change. But again, what does this have to do with trees? During the more recent urban planning in America, urban planners also had to take into account the greenery growing in our cities and towns. And this is where our issue arises. Thank you. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You most likely think I'm going to be talking about how we need to plant more trees to combat climate change. And while this is an important topic and discussion to be had, I'm not the Lorax. No, I am here to discuss the issues with the trees currently planted in America and their impact on us as people. So first, I'm going to be talking about the issues themselves. Second, I'm going to be talking about why these issues haven't been solved. And third, I'm going to be discussing how we can solve these problems. So first, the issues at hand. There are three major alarming issues with the trees planted in America: structural racism, class inequality, and botanical sexism. So first, structural racism and class inequality. Tree distribution should, ideally, be abundant throughout all residential areas. This, unfortunately, is not the case. According to an article done by Brief Policy Perspective, quote, in 1935, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation marked neighborhoods regarded as hazardous with writing on maps to denote which areas not to invest in and to separate the hazardous areas from the so-called best areas, end quote. This is where the term redlining comes from. These hazardous areas were, more often than not, inhabited by marginalized racial groups and/or people living in the lower class. Now, despite being banned under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, redlining continues to impact America to this day. According to the same article from Brief Policy Perspective, quote, neighborhoods with a majority of people of color have 33% less tree coverage than communities that are majority white, and neighborhoods with residents with 90% or more living in poverty have 65% less tree coverage than communities with 10% or less of the population in poverty, end quote. So, because of the racially motivated redlining in America, previously redlined areas have much lower tree coverage than areas that had never been redlined. A local example that we can see of this is Springdale, Arkansas. Since Springdale is so large, it's broken up into different census blocks. In Census Block 514-301-03021, 85% of the population there are people of color, and 79% of the population there live in poverty. It also has a tree equity score of 10. Tree equity scores are numbers on a scale of 0 to 100 that signify how well a specific community is delivering equitable tree canopy cover to all residents. Now let's take a look at another local example from Springdale, Census Block 514-301-03013. Here, 9% of the population are people of color, and 22% of the population live in poverty. However, this census block has a tree equity score of 89. We can clearly see the inequality between an area with a larger proportion of people of color and people living in poverty and an area with a lower proportion of these when it comes to the botanical urban design and tree distribution. Lower tree coverage has terrible health impacts. Within the last 10 years, extreme heat has, on average, killed more people than any other weather phenomena. Previously redlined areas with lower tree coverage provide less shade and relief for the inhabitants of these communities from the extreme high temperatures we've been experiencing as a result of climate change. However, most cities across this nation don't take into account this racial and class inequality when making climate plans, continuing the suffering of these people. And secondly, botanical sexism. How can you be sexist with trees? Well, trees produce sexually. Trees are either monoecious, having both male and female parts, or dioecious, having only male or female parts. Dioecious male trees produce pollen, whereas dioecious female trees produce fruit and seeds. Now, urban planners typically preferred the male trees. Having more male trees planted meant that there would not only be more aesthetically pleasing greenery, but also less fruit and seeds potentially getting on the ground. However, this line of thinking would prove to be incredibly problematic in the future. With the lack of botanical sexual diversity, the pollen being produced by these male trees isn't able to fertilize female trees. This has led to rising amounts of pollen scattering the streets of our cities. This presence of large amounts of pollen has raised the proportion of people who suffer from hay fever, asthma, and other pollen-related allergies. So, because of the decisions made by urban planners for aesthetic reasons, the people of America are suffering from hypersensitivity to the growing amounts of pollen present in our cities and towns. Now, isn't it funny to think how the urban planners in charge of organizing America's infrastructure created such a huge problem for so many, simply because they thought having only male trees would be sufficient? I'm just saying that maybe upholding the patriarchy isn't all it's cut out to be. And I personally am heavily affected by this. In fact, I have to take a medication for my severe allergy to pollen every single day. However, had urban planners simply just incorporated more dioecious female trees into their urban design, this would never have even been an issue. And we can see this all throughout America. According to the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America, Scranton, Pennsylvania is the top 2022 allergy capital for pollen-related allergies. And this comes as a result of poor botanical urban design. Scranton is full of trees and has very high tree equity scores throughout its census blocks. However, nearly all of these trees are dioecious male trees. Without the fertilization of the pollen they produce, the people of this country are going to continue suffering from pollen-related ailments. So, if we're having these glaring issues with the trees planted in America, why haven't any of them been resolved? Well, it's because certain people are benefiting from it through our favorite thing in the world, capitalism. So first, with our issue of structural racism and class inequality, as I previously stated, previously redlined areas, most of which were inhabited by marginalized racial groups and/or people living in the lower class, have much lower tree coverage than areas that had never been redlined. But how can people benefit from this? Through the sale of real estate. Because communities inhabited by larger proportions of people of color and people living in the lower class have lower tree coverage, the housing and other real estate in these areas is less likely to be bought up by people who had been previously living in more middle to upper class areas. Higher tree coverage has not only been shown to lower local temperatures, but it also creates a higher curb appeal for potential buyers. This allows real estate companies to sell its real estate to its middle and higher class clients in areas with higher prices and better tree coverage, rather than selling them real estate in areas with lower prices and less tree coverage. So, because of the inequalities between previously redlined areas and areas that had never been redlined, real estate agents and the real estate market continue to make more money. And secondly, with our issue of botanical sexism, again, as I previously stated, because of the lack of dioecious female trees in this country, the people here are suffering from pollen-related ailments. But how can people benefit from this? Through the sale of pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceutical companies are continuing to get richer, while so many people are suffering from these health conditions being worsened by large amounts of pollen. Treatments to conditions like hay fever and asthma get very expensive. Say someone from the lower class develops asthma as a result of prolonged exposure to large amounts of pollen. An inhaler for this asthma could be upwards of $500 without insurance. And that's just for one person with one inhaler. This lack of dioecious female trees is inadvertently hurting the lower class because most people do not have this kind of money to waste away in an attempt to cure an ailment they have because of the large amounts of pollen present in this country. So, now that we've addressed these problems, how do we solve them? Well, the easiest thing to do would be to plant more trees. However, we have to be smart about the way we go about doing so. Tree planting initiatives need to understand the impact of the trees that they're planting. We can't just be planting trees where we think they look best based on landscaping. Currently, lower class and more urban communities need better tree coverage, so planting more trees here is vital. However, we should also be planting more dioecious female trees to account for the high amount of male trees that have already been planted. By planting these trees with these issues in mind, we can create a better world for all people, not only for the current generation, but for generations to come. Thank you for your time.